Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and what follows is an excerpted clip from one of my longer webinars. So what I've decided is that sometimes when people ask really interesting questions, I will pull out that particular part of a webinar and make it available to you as a short clip so that if you don't have time to watch a 1-hour webinar, you can at least watch and listen to the brief exchanges that I usually have with people who attend my webinars. So here is one such clip from a recent webinar. I hope you enjoy it. And the third one, the essay by Naipaul. Now, as I said, Naipaul is also an apologist for colonialism. And the story about the Indo-Trinidadian population is really interesting. Trinidad and Tobago have almost a 50-50 split between the Indo-Trinidadians and the African Creole population. Now, of course, the Africans were brought in there as slave labor. And after the emancipation of 1830, after Britain abolishes slavery, Trinidad and Tobago were a British colony, so they import workers, right, from Southeast India, right? And these are the workers who are indentured servants. They come to work the fields. And so their communities grow in rural area, and they are farming communities, and they eventually also become business communities. And then there is this division in Trinidad and Tobago. There are two political parties. One is ethnically reliant on the Indian population, the other on the African Creole population. And so that's where Naipaul was born, right? And he becomes a writer and a journalist, but then he aspires to go to England, and that's where he ends up. And by the end of his career, he kind of out-Englishes the English, right? In his sensitivities and in his politics. He's still a great writer, but a very problematic figure. Now, when he writes his travelogues about traveling into the Islamic world, you can already see it has all the biases that you would see in a 19th century European traveler, how he judges the people, how he judges their culture, because his yardstick is the Western civilization, and that's what against which he measures these. But there are also instances in his memoir or travelogue where there is no reason for him to say a thing. Like I was reading the beginning of it, a taxi driver has come to pick him up. And the next line is, I knew I could not trust him. And there is no justification given why not. You know, is it because he's an Iranian taxi driver, or taxi drivers in general cannot be trusted? So Naipaul has these very strong liberal opinions, not liberal, but kind of westernized opinions, right? Where these cultures have nothing redeemable in a way to offer. And they are on a different time zone. And that's why when he writes this essay, Our Universal Civilization, what he's trying to suggest is the pursuit of happiness and upward mobility. These are Western tropes, and these cultures that he has traveled, these Iranians and others, they still have them. But on the other hand, they're anti-West and anti-American. And that's the irony he's trying to point out. But if you look at it, that's the irony a lot of racists would point out to you. These are the tools that they use, right? Masood Raja, why do you criticize America? Why shouldn't you be grateful that you can live here, right? Or there are so many terrible things about India and Pakistan. So that's the kind of mentality that is at play, privileging the richness of the Western civilization at the cost of anything redeemable about the Iranians or about the Muslims. And so he was very well liked by the British conservatives because, after all, here is a cultural insider giving them the vocabularies that they themselves were reluctant to use, right? And it happens a lot when you can incorporate an insider or cultural informant. I mean, think of here. I remember 10 years ago when Florida was debating to sign off on Equal Rights Amendment, there was a panel that came and discussed and was totally opposed to it, and they were all women. And since they were women opposed to something that could have benefited women, it lent more credence to their argument. If you can get from within the constituency that is fighting for their rights or anything else to speak on behalf of power, then somehow it becomes a more persuasive argument. So in so many ways, Naipaul was used. I don't think so he himself would have intended that for that. Now, my first encounter with a Naipaul scholar who absolutely believed in his greatness was when I was a graduate student. I contributed an essay to a special issue on V S Naipaul. And the editor, of course, was an uncritical supporter of Naipaul. And my essay was really critical of Naipaul's work. And he wrote me like a long email telling me I didn't know much about Naipaul. And I wrote him back and I said, look, theoretically, I'm trying to write a way in which we can retrieve a kind of Naipaul that we can use. So if you are interested in that, I'll write the essay. So he finally apologized and said, we later became good friends. But so a highly accomplished figure, but also a highly problematic figure in terms of minority rights in Britain, but also Muslim rights, and a highly controversial figure. Things that he has written or talked about are mobilized by the BJP because, you know, if someone supports that India is a Hindu nation and that it should be proud of being a Hindu, that becomes a big tool in the hands of those who believe in that majoritarian idea of India instead of an India that is sensitive to the nuances of different regions, different religions, and all. So he gets appropriated by them a lot. There's another question from, how do you think Western culture has changed the way developing countries grow? I mean, that's a huge question because, I mean, it has one monolithic idea, Western culture at one end, and then developing countries at the other end. So you know that the Western culture is not a monolithic culture. It's also divided by country, by politics. Within each nation, then there are other ramifications of race, gender, and then the developing countries also depends on their politics, their resources, their regions. But by and large, my reading it, and you can read people like Amartya Sen and Samir Amin. These are the economists who have written about the developing economies and the power of the, if not the West, North Atlantic regions. So in the 80s, late 80s, the developmental model was led by the World Bank, and it was a very ecologically disastrous developmental model because these ideas and imperatives came from Western way of thinking the world. And the policies that were implemented by so many different nations were actually deeply destructive to their environment. And then now, because of the work of people like Samir Amin and Amartya Sen and others, the European and American economists and developmental theorists have to think the world differently, and also people who do eco-criticism and all. So, I mean, depending on who you are, where you are, what your politics is, would decide, how you view development and developmental initiatives launched from the so-called West. But there are some constraints on developing countries that they absolutely cannot do without. I mean, if you look at majority of the developing nations owe money to IMF. And if you owe money to IMF, that means that part of your budget has to be allocated to paying the interest on that loan. But IMF also gets the power to dictate to you what kind of economic policy you must make. Because when you borrow money from IMF, what you've also agreed to is that they will have the right to dictate what your economic policy will be to safeguard their loan. So not a lot of developing nations are autonomous in that sense, especially when it comes to their economic policy. But then there are also imperatives of World Trade Organization, right? To trade or participate in the world trade, you have to sign off on the universal copyright law, right? And other things. And if you don't do that, of course, you can be penalized. So by and large, the global economy and the pace of development is still dictated by the powerful nations. I mean, the only nations that can somewhat defy it are China and India, you know. But then, no, not many nations have such powerful economies, or, you know, such powerful military forces, or such strong political systems. Thank you so much for watching or listening to this brief clip. If you are interested in the longer version, the link will be in the description and you can watch the whole webinar. Thank you so much for your support. And as always, if you have any questions, any concerns, you can always post them in the comments and I'll be happy to respond to them. If you have a moment and if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, please do so now so that you get timely notifications of whatever is happening on this channel. Thank you for your support. Stay safe, and as always, from me to you, peace and love.